Valuing our opinions, that is our opinion. We're glad you called.
Where's it going?
What kind of odors do you find most offensive? Cooking odor?
No one who did more investigating work than Susan did on all of their holdings across the country, who were in their groups. I mean, she interviewed both of them at length. She called them up on the phone, they called her up on the phone. She really did a lot.
That's really good. Yes, I put some other lines in there. That's really the human balance. Perspective.
Hello, Peter.
Peter?
Hi there.
Come on in.
You gotta sit down next to Lynn.
Tuna fish is okay.
Yeah, but I'm cold.
Okay. Are you sure you don't want to sit on this side of the table here?
For some place to get started, and by no means.
You have extra copies of that?
I have my copy.
Was that sent to our offices today?
Yeah, I faxed it on
I
Tuesday.
didn't get it.
Yeah, they didn't get it.
You didn't get it either? All right. If I give you this copy, I won't know what the questions are. But here, this is what they are. Generally speaking.
Just take that copy and I'll
Okay. We were going to try to do some scene setting. So start the whole thing with each of you saying your name and what your role was at the time. And then kind of go through what was the situation that caused all the agreements to seem like a great idea in the first place. How was the urban group? You know, did they call us? Did we call them? What? What did the agreements say? What happened to change everything? Tax law changing, things like that. And then the pieces related to what was the whole case about? What were the three cases? All of that sort of stuff. And then what was the settlement? And what I was thinking there, Shelley, is the story that I've heard about how it was all settled on a cocktail napkin and you and Stuart and Artie and Marty had dinner or ran into each other. I don't even know if that's true, but at any rate, that was kind of the idea with the end of it. And we've got an hour and 45 minutes, and the people's names that I put there were just ideas, and clearly everybody is going to have stuff to say that I might not put you in the right spot for them, so speak on up. All right. Want to start in any particular order?
Your call.
Okay. Please introduce yourselves. Mr. Johnson.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Jerry Johnson, and I served as counsel to the PDA during the one of the PDA's counsel.
My name is Harris Thompson. I was executive director at the time. The set of agreements were signed.
I'm Jerry Thone. I was chair of the PDA council at the time the first group of agreements were signed. Yeah, possibly the second.
I am Shelley Yap. I was the deputy mayor to Mayor Charles Royer. At the time, the PDA council brought this issue to the city's attention. Subsequently came down to the market to work for the PDA council as consultant to try to resolve the disputes, and subsequently, almost simultaneous with our filing the lawsuit, became the executive director of the PDA.
I'm Jackson Schmidt. I was co-counsel for the Citizens Alliance to keep the Pike Place Market public.
My name is Len Larson. I was also co-counsel for the Citizens Alliance.
And I'm Peter Steinbrook, and I founded the Citizens Alliance and chair of the organization as well.
Okay. Thanks. So, for the setting the scene, I was thinking that it was mostly Jerry and Harris here to talk a little bit about what was going on in the 70s and the 80s. That, you know, why did PDA need money? It's a nonprofit. Just kind of describe from that standpoint.
probably Harris wasn't here at the
Oh, that's true.
first set of agreement, so, but I was, and at that time, John Clouse was the executive director, and he had succeeded George Rolfe, and in the 70s, of course, the initiative passed in 71, the PDA became active a couple of years later, and during that period of time, was going through the design process, the acquisition process, the negotiation with urban renewal people, and the focus really of the Save the Market effort at that time was trying to acquire and rehabilitate some very old and unfortunately decrepit buildings. And the focus really hadn't turned so much to the operations of the market. During the 70s, we got a great deal of city and federal help. Senator Magnuson was very helpful. The urban renewal department at the city was very helpful. The urban staff and the funds did come in with sufficient quantity to undertake many of the major repairs. About this time, about 1980, of course, Senator Magnuson was going out of office. The federal funds were somewhat drying up. The city funds were drying up. The urban renewal funds were running out, and there was a real problem concerning the finding of sufficient funds to finish the rehabilitation project. Particularly at that time, as I recall, there were no funds to rehabilitate the sanitary market and the triangle. And so, out of the blue came this idea. Where it came from, I can't really tell you. From the council's point of view, it appeared that it came from the city itself. And came to the council from the city, maybe from the urban renewal people, but it came through staff to the council. There was this proposal that sounded very logical at the time. It basically said there's a great value here in the appreciation. People all around the city with historic projects and other public projects are selling that depreciation right and retaining money. And so that's how it started.
So, Jerry, you were working for Maggie, then were you, sir? Anything to add?
Oh, no, no, that predated that, and Jerry's right, Senator Magnuson left office at the end of 1980, and he had done what he could do in terms of providing supplemental appropriated funds. Just, there's work to be done, he wasn't there.
Well, in 1983, when I was hired specifically with the mandate that there were no more outside funds that the market actually had to pay for itself. So I think the early agreements had been put in place, and then shortly after I was hired, our chief financial officer came to me and said the market is in terrible shape. She used it bankrupt. And then my operations guys started coming to me and saying we have all this deferred maintenance on the older buildings that need to be done. So then I started inquiring from the brief time I had been with John Clyde, we had intersected. He had mentioned that he had done these earlier transactions, so I said, did you do that when? At that point, I think before I Goldmark firm introduced me back to these guys who showed up. So this is what we've done. They had done the Pantages Theater, tax credit project, Pantages Theater in Tacoma. They had done the Bush Hotel here as well. So
The principal attorney in the first round was really Chuck Goldmark, and from the Lewis firm, and as Harris said, the market really was barely surviving financially in those days. Looking back at it, I think the reason was that we had hired staff that had great skills in acquiring property, handling the real estate aspects of it, handling the rehabilitation aspects of it, contracts, getting buildings suitably approved and back in operation. But no one really had experience with operating the market. Nobody had any skill at that time with setting appropriate levels of rent that would be sufficient to pay for the day-to-day operations and the necessary maintenance. And that is, in fact, the situation that Harris came into. His first mandate was to try to get the market back on a sound financial basis. So in the 80s, early 80s, 81, there was something very close to a financial crisis. There just wasn't enough money to keep going, and the sources that we relied on maybe too much had pretty well dried up. So when this news came in that this money was available, that everybody was doing it, and our council looked over the agreements and staff and advised the council that there was no chance that the market would be in any danger. New payments were coming up that would force these people to leave the scene as soon as they had taken their appreciation. And that was the background.
So could somebody describe what the agreement said? And they were done in 2 segments, right?
What did they say?
Yeah.
I mean,
The rough idea.
as anyone who's worked on later knows, they said all sorts of things, many of them contradictory to each other. But they were basically, the early agreements were sale documents, the later agreements were lease documents, but they effectively transferred some bundle of ownership rights with the intention of not transferring the management rights, but in along with transferring the ownership rights, they transferred some of the taxable rights and the ability to have tax credits passed on to the owners. So essentially, they were fairly complicated agreements, and maybe other people would spend a lot more time talking about it. But the thrust behind negotiating at least the second set of agreements was to pass enough rights to qualify as a taxable event without actually transferring management rights. And that was a very convoluted and complex negotiation that took place. And, you know, obviously, our advice was that we had successfully kept management control, whether, you know, that turned out to be true or not. I don't follow the later legal struggles, but our struggle when we were negotiating it was trying to make sure this qualified. Their struggle was to make sure it qualified. It was all in the context of, does this qualify as a taxable event? It was never in the context of, is it a management transfer?
You know, I think you have to look at this at 2 points in time, when it was done and then when it fell apart, because things are always easier to criticize in hindsight than they are when you're doing it. At the time these agreements were done, most simply put, you had a public nonprofit entity who couldn't take advantage of federal tax laws, and you had private investors who needed money. This entity needed money. You had private investors who could take advantage of those tax rights and would pay to have the ability to do so. So you were transferring what the PA thought it was doing, was transferring some tax benefits that it couldn't use to somebody who could, in exchange for a dollar value that they could then reinvest in the market. And in so doing, these were designed, so everybody thought, on the one hand, to pass the IRS muster. On the other hand, once the tax advantages were used up, to collapse, because they weren't set up to be profitable to these people. They were set up. The thing that's so hard for people to understand is that a lot of people make more money out of showing losses than out of showing profits. And so they were designed to show losses that would then lower the tax burden on the individual limited partner investments. In terms of the management agreement that went with that, in effect what happened was that the urban group entities had a management agreement with the PDA, which was designed for the PDA to continue to operate just as it had operated without them present. And particularly in light of the fact that the PDA's charter had to be conformed with, that there had to be conformance with the historic district ordinance, that basically all of the tools that were already in place to direct the public interest management of the market remained in place. And so it had to be operating within that context. So at the time, it appeared as if nothing of consequence was being exchanged.
So when you mentioned balloon payments, they were 20 years out?
Yeah,
A long time.
15 years out.
they're actually,
No, they don't want
just to add to what Shelley said, that Shelley's absolutely right, is that normally in a conventional private transaction, you have all of the attributes of ownership in one place, and that entitles you to certain things, including the ability to manage your asset and to take whatever tax benefits are associated with your ownership of that asset. So you get investment tax credits if you put money into your property. If it happens to be an historic property, you get credits for restoring an historic building. You get depreciation of your investment over time. And what these transactions attempted to do was to separate that bundle of ownership rights in a way that would give enough of it to the private party who could take advantage of the tax benefits without compromising the management authority of and the ultimate ability to retain the asset of the PDA. In fact, although these transactions were popular around the country, and maybe because of that, Congress decided that it was inappropriate for transactions of this nature to continue, or certainly to be done in the way that they were being done, like these transactions, and actually changed the law. And that was one of the reasons why the urban group changed its approach to the market, because the value of the tax benefits that they expected to continue to enjoy on a going forward basis through the end of the period of time when the balloon payments came due was diminished by change in the federal tax law. Now, it is also true that some of the more valuable benefits had already been fully taken by them, the credits, at a shorter time than the depreciation, for instance. And the market, unlike the other investments that they made around the country and elsewhere, actually, in their view, represented an opportunity to realize real money in addition to tax benefits from their transactions. And they had experience in other parts of the country in projects where, in addition to tax benefits, things like the market in their mind produced real money. The seaport in New York, and it was also the case that since they came into the market, the sort of entertainment, festival, retail idea gained currency around the country, the Rouse projects and so on. And they began to see a live commercial activity here that was different from how they originally conceived their relationship with the market, which was as a passive owner of tax benefits. So they not only were facing a diminution in the value of their tax benefits, but they also started to seek to take an active role in management in order to get the market to perform economically like a Rouse festival retail project.
I think that's a major point. You see, it was the change in the tax law, which I think we couldn't have predicted, but the thing that may have made these deals imprudent was the fact that we did not foresee that the market would one day become a prosperous commercial entity.
Well, the agreements were really put in, I mean, it couldn't become that as long as public management was maintained. I mean, because it was clear even then that this place was a viable place and managed differently might be of economic benefit to them. I mean, that was part of the original negotiations, was to set as many controls in place so they could not exploit. I mean, that was not unforeseen. That was part of the delegate negotiations.
Well, that's right, Harrison. This actually, the chronology started way earlier than this, because in 1989, or maybe even the end of 1988, they started to make entreaties to Mike Carroll, who's Shelley's predecessor, about minor changes here and there. Can't you get more money out of this tenant? Shouldn't this lease be changed? This and that, which caused Mike to begin to worry.
Well, but wait a minute, the motivation for that, in my view, was rested with the change in federal tax law. The federal tax law was revised twice, in '86 and '87. It went into effect in '89. So, one of the fundamental premises of that tax law was that it established a distinction between active and passive income.
Right.
And active income is like salary, and most of these guys were lawyers, and although they had big salaries, they were salaried people. And all of these deals that they made around the country, they could take these losses against their active income. That was another tax benefit that they were receiving, in addition to tax credits, in addition to depreciation. Once the tax law changed, they then are sitting here with a bunch of things that now say, this is all passive income. You can only take passive losses against passive gains. You can no longer use those losses to reduce the income tax you're going to pay on your salary. So they then had to begin to look around among the real estate investments they had, the Pantages theaters, et cetera, and say, do we have any of these that can make us any money? So that if we make some money off of one, then we can also take the passive losses from the others against that.
That's right.
And their assessment was, voila, the market. We can make the market into a moneymaker, and we'll make money on the market, and we'll be able to offset the losses over here against that active income. And more tax advantages for them. So their motivation in beginning to try to move the management of the market into questioning whether certain tenants should remain, pushing more of the cost through to the tenant's rent, was all premised on their trying to change this from a paper loss to a gain in order to and be able to retain tax advantages.
So as Jerry said, in the late 80s, they suddenly started showing up and making suggestions about how to run the market or what might be done. And of course, Mike Carroll was...
There were more than just suggestions, I think, as we got closer to 1990.
They got
there
more
were demands.
They became more and more aggressive. Yeah.
To close the
But when they first showed up, they were just...
Right, and they made some significant mistakes as they pushed that. But one of the things that they did, they were very serious about this because they retained one of the city's leading law firms to represent them. They also retained probably the most powerful political public relations firm to help them. And they were positioning the market to look like a badly run operation that they could then represent themselves as effectively saving by trying to do what they were doing. And they went around to the editorial boards. They were actually beginning to make some progress on that.
They went around to tenants.
That's right, they went to tenants. Things would get better. We would, make these improvements, and not to worry, everything will be the same, but you'll have, sky bridges to the moon and so forth. I don't think that we actually sort of woke up to the magnitude of the challenge on the public relations front until relatively late in the game and started to get more aggressive about that ourselves. also started to, we also engaged a battery of experts to begin to try to understand their situation and what was driving them from an economic standpoint. And Shelley and the council made the determination to hire top-flight real estate expertise to evaluate not just the value of what they had legally, but also their various schemes and the cost of doing them and so on if they have been implemented, and also to attempt to model. We hired a national real estate tax council, attempt to model their tax situation so we could understand their economic position in relationship to these investments against the tax law changes that Shelley mentioned.
One of the things that is important, I think, to put in this picture or emphasize a little bit more was the fact that the initial deals began in 1980, the second deals were in 1983, and it wasn't until, to the best of my knowledge, till about 87, 88, when they began to start making, after the tax laws began to change, they began to start making demands, and those demands then escalated. And they specifically escalated. I recall, Jerry, specifically that you came to the city when I was you and Jerry and Mike Carroll came to the mayor's office at the point where they had refused to allow you to cut the sky bridge from the garage into the main arcade. They wanted it redesigned to go into the lower levels of the market.
That's right.
That option, of course, had been already looked at and wasn't a feasible option to do, but they had, under the strict interpretation of these agreements, they had the ability to approve capital projects of that sort. So then the market really knew that these guys were going to try to take this over. And that's the point at which those escalations were the point at which the market came to the city and said, we think we've got a big problem here. We may need your help on this. And that was the first introduction of the city back into this issue as those demands begun. That was also part of, the city had just hired, or not on a pro bono basis, a PR firm who was training council members and staff of how do we talk to people. And I recall very clearly that Mayor Royer's reaction and mine immediately was, you have to tell everybody about this. Nobody will be able to take away the market if you tell everybody that it's under this kind of threat. So that it became a very early, then at that point, we need to get our story out, we need to work more with the community. Up to that point, there had been kind of a little bit of a stonewall. I remember early conversations with you, Peter, when Peter and people in the community who were seeing weird things happening on this, not being able to get the kind of information that they wanted. So that just added to the suspicion. And there was a little, there was almost a siege occurring. There were other events occurring at the same time that had to do with rent increases for the baseball tenants, and so there were lots of other pressures that were going on at the same time. But there was a very clear methodical escalation of their demands for actions that would show control on their part and were designed to increase the market's profitability. That led us very quickly into a realization in early 1990 that we were going to have to fight them legally on whether the agreements would be illegal to have entered into in the first place, on whether they could demand that we take certain actions that we thought were contrary to the historic district ordinance and our charter, and the specific demand that ultimately triggered the filing of the lawsuit was that we pass through what's called all common area maintenance charges, 100% to all of the commercial tenants, which would have been a huge increase if we passed all those costs, plus a management fee of 15% through to all the tenants in their effort to increase revenues.
So all common area plus 15%.
Right.
And so then the PDA and the city both filed suit, and that's what started all the legal.
Meantime, the Citizens Alliance had formed. The Citizens Alliance had formed, was searching for counsel, and had arguments to bring to this. I think that one of the strengths of our legal triumvirate here was that different people could make different arguments most effectively. And I think the argument that could be made most effectively by the citizens was that the PDA never had the authority to enter into these agreements in the first place.
And that's
called
how-
ultra-virus.
And that's obviously an argument that the PDA itself are not making.
That was the real benefit of having, that was one of the benefits, I think, of having the Citizen Alliance. I think the other one, and Peter can talk about this as well, but you had the city and you had the PDA, government bureaucracies of various types and shapes, but the folks at the market, what really makes the market, wasn't really a part of it until we had people like Nancy Dowdy and and the socios and the markets themselves. Nancy Tucker, the cheese person, was very involved. This was a way of dramatizing and bringing to life what otherwise was a very dry and complicated legal mess that was hard to sort out. But when you say Nancy Tucker is not going to be able to sell cheese in the cheese market anymore, it's a way of bringing it home.
And when they made the demand for passing through that much more costs, that's exactly the kind of argument that could be attested to by the individual tenants, which also led into, if these types of owner-operated operations cannot make it economically in the market, it will transform the market. That is inconsistent with the historic district ordinance. Meanwhile, the city, who's not represented here today so they can speak for themselves, but meanwhile, the city had another element, another issue from their perspective, and that is that they could see coming down the line the urban group coming after them in the event that they were not able to work their will and take over the market and make a profit out of it. And they certainly knew that the city had a lot deeper pocket than the PDA did. So one of the city's interests, in addition to the interest of retaining the market in public hands, one of the city's interests was to say, we have these public development authorities and they are arm's length relationships with us. We do not have responsibility for their liabilities, and that was a very important part of the city's participation in this as well. So each of the entities could make differing arguments, legal arguments, that collectively was a major bombardment to the urban group.
Although it's interesting, Shelley, the city also took the position that they was the beneficiary under the covenants and the deeds.
Oh, right.
That's what gave them standing to file a lawsuit.
Right. Well, actually, and that's because I believe the deeds carry a warranty that from us that the agreements will continue to be, that the property will be continued to be used consistent with the historic district ordinance.
Right.
So that if it weren't, then the deeds were invalid and it would revert to them from who got it in the first place, right?
So complex.
Peter, maybe you could describe how you formed the Citizens Alliance and how, from your perspective, how you got here.
Okay. Well, I was chair of the Market Historical Commission from 1983 through 1989, actually through 1990, January. And I, up until around 1989, knew very little about the nature of those transactions, and I was on the commission at the time. Some of them were entered into, and they didn't draw a lot of attention either in the press or in the market. They were represented as complicated tax deals that would bring the market a steady source of needed additional income to finish the renovation and possibly contribute to the maintenance. So it sounded good at the time. And then the urban group began to step up its demands around in the year 1989, and at the same time they gave Mike Carroll ulcers, I believe, the then PDA director after Harris Hoffman, and Mike Carroll began coming to me with grave concerns, and they were expressed in his face, as I recall. And those concerns caused me to look into it in much more detail and to also develop very serious concerns. In fact, it was unconscionable at the time that an outside group of private investors could make such a claim to the market, given the enormous public effort that had gone into saving it in the 60s and early 70s, and the clear public purpose that the market was saved for, the public dollars. It just was absolutely unconscionable, outrageous, and confounding as to how we could have gotten into such a situation.
Well, and also, Peter, the relative value of their contribution financially was
That's
minuscule
right.
compared to the...
$2 million or something like that.
More than that.
They claimed to have purchased the market for this very low down payment.
Maybe $50, $60 million of federal and local money had gone into these buildings. Yeah.
And so as their demand stepped up for ending leases with marginal businesses, for cutting the social service functions out of the market, including the child care center, to suggestions of creating a food circus and the Rouse-like concept of a festival market, all these things just increased, raised our blood level and our ire over this. And I turned to the city as chair of the commission for help in 1989. And I recall an assistant attorney general, city attorney speaking to the commission and telling us that the city really couldn't do anything about it. That this was a legal matter between the PDA and the investors, and the city had a hands-off policy due to its relationship with PDAs and had to stay out of it. That was not what I wanted to hear. I felt that we did need to show a unified front, and we needed to put up a strong legal resistance to what the urban group was attempting to do. So in 1990, I quit the Historical Commission and organized the Citizens Alliance to keep the Pike Place Market public. And that organization was formed for that purpose, to ensure that we would retain ownership and control of the Pike Place Market in the public interest. And I would add that the PDA's credibility at that time was quite low. And it was not, people were not trusting of what they were hearing, were confused, angry, bewildered, didn't know who to believe. And I felt that we could provide...
Sounds like now.
Things haven't changed much. And clearly there was a need for an independent third-party participation in the effort to save the market once again. So we didn't have the city's support at that time. There was distrust of the PDA, and there were strong reasons legally why we needed a third party to intervene. And the organization was formed primarily for the purpose of setting up a legal defense and to pursue it on a legal basis on behalf of the citizenry. And the organization was a coalition of all the interested organizations in the market, the Merchants Association, the Daytol, the constituency, the Market Foundation, as well as some of the citywide organizations that had a role in saving the market, the Friends of the Market, Allied Arts, and we even had labor organizations involved in the effort. So we had pretty broad support citywide, and so we went into it with full vigor and with the intent of doing whatever was necessary to end the relationship with the ogre.
And I think, Peter, that you're absolutely right in terms of how helpful and important it was that the citizens group be there. Just two additional points on that. One is that I think it was essential across the board that we took, as we decided to, a very aggressive public posture with respect to these people, and let them know at every level and in every venue that they were in for the fight of their lives. Shelley's right, we decided to go public with that. Ultimately, when Shelley came over to the PDA, mayor's term was ending. He was not running again. He came here. That gave additional impetus to that. And the only other point I guess I'd make, Peter, is that the role of the alliance in terms of the legal defense was, and offense, since we took the offensive, was very important, and that the legal strategy among the three parties was always very highly coordinated. That we worked together very, very well, and the decisions we made about who was taking which argument and so forth were carefully reached by consensus among all of us.
The Citizens Alliance actually had sued PDA, and so the PDA was the defendant as to us, and yet at every stage we were, as Jerry says, meeting, coordinating, and strategizing to figure out how we would.
We also contemplated suing the city as well initially, but felt that would be perhaps taking on too much. I think, but there wasn't initially a common agreement in terms of the outcome that was sought with the relationship of the Urban Group. I think initially there was sentiment that perhaps there was a solution that didn't necessitate dissolving or terminating the contracts with the Urban Group. And I never accepted or allowed for such a solution. I felt that we absolutely had to dissolve those deals, and I think when Shelley came on board, our first conversation, we found ourselves in agreement. But it was unclear ultimately what the resolution would be from a legal standpoint. But I think Shelley and I were in strong agreement that ultimately that had to be the solution, while others might have suggested other possible scenarios.
Well, it wasn't an argument that we as the PDA could make. I remember very distinctly, and from when I was in the mayor's office standpoint, which I shared quite openly with Peter, and I think helped, as we were just getting to know each other, help create a good relationship among us. My first reaction to the mayor after the PDA left the room is they can't do that. We created them to operate in the market. So the notion that they didn't have the authority to enter into the agreements was one that Peter and I agreed on from the very beginning. And so I think we did have a common notion there that we weren't sure how we were going to get there. In fact, I think one of the things that's important to also know, and not well known externally, was that all sorts of options were looked at. And in fact, we had all sorts of things in our back pocket of if this happened, we were going to try this, etc. I remember an early meeting with you and me and Peter Ecklick and Jerry on changes we were going to make to the historic district ordinance if they succeeded.
They're cracking down on that.
I remember discussions that Jerry and I had with unnamed senators in Washington, D.C. on changes in the tax law that would screw them if they tried to use this property improperly. So, and in fact, we had some of those things on tap. Were we not successful in the lawsuit? When at the point, and Jerry, help me out at this. At the point that we, or was it immediately after when we filed the suit? When Jerry said they were escalating the notion that we were mismanaging the market, they had Arthur Anderson do a supposed audit of us and made a claim for some $8 million, if I remember correctly, dollars that we owed them, the vast majority of which was because we hadn't been passing through 100% of the CAN charges.
That was based on a claim that the PDA's rental charges were really too low.
Right.
And that began to, they began to lose the public relations.
Right. And in fact, what they did, in just reviewing the court records and the different pleadings that were filed shortly after they filed suit, they took the offensive and moved for receivership.
Yeah.
Which was just a great crisis at the time, essentially seeking to divest the PDA of any rights to manage the market. It was a real shot across the bow. And
that you really ought to talk about in a little more detail, because I thought that was very important development. And they were not only going to go into receivership, but they were going to do it in New York.
No, Jerry, that was not the bankruptcy. They wanted to have a receiver appointed to manage the market in lieu of the PDA.
Right.
That's
right.
But in all fairness, if they could have had a receiver in New York, they would have.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
But it was the bankruptcy that
That was their counter move to our filing.
Right, we filed the lawsuits,
exactly.
they filed to.
We meaning collectively, all of us had filed lawsuits.
Yeah, and all three opposed, yeah, it was, and at the time, Judge Sullivan had been appointed the judge, and he hadn't made any rulings at that time. We had an initial conference, but that was really about all that we had had, and Judge Sullivan was a veteran judge, but there was real uncertainty on how things would proceed. It was a very vigorous argument. I remember that, and I think this was one of the instances that I remember where the Alliance was helpful in bringing in testimony from merchants who could say, if you implement these changes, we will go out of business.
Right, and the city was helpful then too, because they hired Deloitte Touche.
Right.
To go through, they must have had 130, I think it was, tenants that they went to, got the tenants to agree, provide them their tax returns. We were giving them information about what their rent would have gone up if we'd been passing through 100% of the CAM charges, so that Deloitte Touche, without revealing what people were making, could go through and say, this person would have lost money, gone out of business. So the city paid for that element of it so that they could be making the argument that this would have been violation of the Historic District City Ordinance at that time. We also at that time, we had our opportunity to review this so-called audit was that we had to go to their offices. Help me out on this, Jerry. We had like 8 hours.
Right.
At Anderson.
Oh, was it Anderson?
Yeah, it was at Anderson.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And
right.
I recall.
That's right.
Yeah, I recall that one of the there were several attorneys with us and our accountants and right our outside accountants, our internal finance person, myself. We had a couple of people that were doing nothing but sitting there with laptop computers copying the audit so that we would actually have a copy of this and we could do analysis other than 4 hours in their offices. And that led to an effort at a counteroffensive on our part to say this is baloney. The market's not been mismanaged. They just want to pass through. They're just saying we didn't get enough revenue.
In fact, they scheduled a press conference at which they were going to reveal
the audit. Right.
And you may remember, Shelley, but we jumped them and had our own that morning in which we revealed it and attacked it.
Right.
And so they were immediately, we had charts and you were the
Right, and I very clearly remember, there are all sorts, as there always are in things like this, are little stories that you never forget. And I remember that one of the statements in that, one of our key lines in that is, we don't owe them a dime.
That's right.
And the next meeting we had, I could not bear Arthur. I mean, I just couldn't, he's one of those people that I couldn't bear.
Arthur Mullman.
Arthur Mullman, Marty and Arthur.
Marty and Artie.
Marty and Artie. Marty, I actually could get along with fine, but Arthur, I just couldn't bear. And he walks into the next meeting that we end up, this is later on, that we end up actually sitting across the table, and he had been staying at the inn at the market, and he tossed me an envelope, a stationary envelope from them, and I opened it up, and it's out falls a dime, and he has written me a poem that says, roses are red, violets are blue, I have a dime, here's one for you.
So that story reminds me of one. Jackson actually is better able to tell this, but one of the problems that we had when we filed our lawsuit was several weeks after the city and the PDA was getting these guys served.
Right, I remember that.
We had real problems getting them served, and then so I'll let Jackson take it from here.
We had the option of getting them served in New York, but we were afraid to do so under the long-arm statute because if for some reason the court determined that there wasn't jurisdiction under long-arm, our client would be liable for attorney's fees. So we really wanted to get them served here in town. And we heard that they were in town, probably through you, Shelley, and that they were staying at the inn at the market. So I called.
In fact, everyone was sort of on notice to alert us wherever they were seen in town.
And called one of the local service companies, ABC or one of the others, and they sent one of those bicycle messengers up there and going to the inn at the market, trying to catch them in the had any luck. And one evening, he stopped up there and finally asked for it at the front desk. And the desk said, no, they've gone out for dinner. Well, he went riding away, and he was riding down Western Avenue, and he saw these two guys walking down the street. And just on a whim, he pulled over and said, are you by any chance and Marty? And they said yes, and he handed them the papers. And they signed for him. And the next thing when I got this from the guy, I said, how did you know? Did you know where they were going for dinner? Were you looking for them? He said, no, I was just riding back to the office. I said, well, why did you pull those two guys over? He said, they were the only two guys in town who looked like they were from New York.
Well, to bring us back to progress on this for a minute, but also taking another story out of this is that just about every year on Halloween, Jerry calls me and we have a good chuckle because it was Halloween Day when Judge Sullivan issued his most significant ruling. He had previously issued that he denied their receivership, but he had put us on a real short string, that they had to approve any leases longer than a year and things of that sort. But at this point, he then ruled that the regulatory scheme, which is what became the wording for the combination of the Historic District Ordinance, the deed covenants, and the PDA charter, that those were paramount, so that therefore their efforts to get us to pass through more costs that would change the character of the market could not occur, that the agreements, in fact, were ultra vires. They just lost everything in court on Halloween 1990.
Yeah.
Jackson, maybe you could explain that motion, because I think you wrote the motion that the judge ruled on.
Well, it was Len and I, in conjunction with the attorneys for the PDA and the city, we were passing briefs around, and everybody was working on everybody's arguments. But the principal argument at the motion for summary judgment, and as I recall, they moved first.
Yeah, they did.
And so the issue, and at the time, that was very curious to us because we thought that they were trying to delay things and increase our costs, et cetera. And then suddenly, boom, after the receivership, here they come and they try to strike out two of our claims. And they only moved on two of the alliance's claims, leaving one potentially for trial, which was a sham transaction claim. And we decided in meetings with the city and with the PDA that the best strategy for us was not just to defend against their motion, but to cross them. So we did. And our argument was quite simply that the PDA was chartered to govern the market, that was a municipal obligation, and that it was a non-delegable duty. You can't take these governmental functions and put them in the hands of private entities like the urban group. And they didn't stand a chance in retrospect. I mean, you have a judge like Judge Sullivan, who's a tried and true Seattle person, and you've got the market, which is beloved by all. It seems inconceivable that the judge could have ever ruled anything contrary. And luckily for us, the law support is right down the pipe.
So the essence of the decision was that the PDA could not contract itself out of existence or delegate its authority to anyone. And the Judge Sullivan, rest his soul, finished with the statement of Happy Halloween.
He opened with Happy Halloween.
Yes.
He came into the room and said, Happy Halloween.
That's what we knew. We were going to get something out of it.
Yeah.
This is just one of those little footnotes, but don't I remember correctly that a different judge had been assigned and that the urban group
Judge Sharp.
preempted, or
They
what do
did
you
an
call that?
affidavit.
Affidavit.
That's right. It was
On
Judge
the first
Peckman.
judge.
I was
That's
also,
right.
that was Marshall Peckman.
Right.
Who was a superb judge and would have been a very good judge for the case.
I'm sorry, you were all talking at the same
Yeah.
time, I didn't get the point.
It was there.
Seriously, that the judge that turned out to be this fabulous judge for us became the judge for this case after they affidavit, which means they said disqualified the judge who had been assigned to the case originally.
Okay.
and of course, one of the initial decisions we had to make after they affidavit Judge Peckman and we were assigned Judge Sullivan was Judge Sullivan the right guy for this case? And
I think there was a lot of worry about that.
Yeah,
And,
there was.
he was not, he customarily did not handle complex civil litigation.
Now, here's the other interesting thing that happened, and if my memory serves me correctly, it was the same day, that at the beginning, before he made his ruling, the Vogel indicated to the judge that they wanted a conference.
I think it wasn't that day. It was when we came back about a month later on the order.
That's right, on the order.
That's why we were negotiating, trying to get an
Right.
order with them, and we came, every time we would get close, there would always be some other thing that would come up.
Right, right. For lay people, what that means is that after the judge rules, then the winning side goes and writes up what the judge ordered. And you use a transcript, and you have to get agreement from the attorneys on the other side that yes, this is indeed what they said. And so this is what we were dealing with. But we go into court that day to get this ruling, and Vogel tells the judge that as soon as they made the ruling, they want a conference with the attorneys and with the judge. So we get the ruling entered, and we go into the attorneys go into the chamber, and Vogel says, we're out of this.
We want to withdraw.
We want to withdraw, we have to get paid.
No, we weren't even in the room.
We didn't go.
We did.
Oh, yes, Fred Townsend was in the room.
That was
Yes.
in November of 1990 when
Right.
they asked to be.
Right.
You know what, I don't think we had the order in.
We never did.
Because they
Because they withdrew, oh, that's
They
right.
also said, and by the way, our client has filed bankruptcy.
That's right.
Right,
That's
right, that's right.
In New York.
That's right.
And the judge,
That's exactly right.
and the judge refused to enter the order properly, because at that point there was a stay.
Right.
We couldn't do it. And that reminds me of another one of Arthur's little missives to, I think it was to you, when somebody asked him, or it might have been Fred, asked him about the bankruptcy, and he just said, like a flower, it will unfold.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
At that point, Vogel had run up a bill of about over $1 million with the Urban Group, and they had taken a lot of, it had not been good PR for them to be representing the Urban Group, and after the Urban Group had supposedly lost its asset on the market, there wasn't really anything left for them after Judge Sullivan's ruling. So.
Well, but furthermore, the thing that was such a bummer about this is, about the bankruptcy filing, is that, it moved back to New York. They filed bankruptcy
Filed in New York.
in New York. B, when you file bankruptcy and that proceeding had been stayed, in effect, their effort was to retry the whole thing.
Right.
In bankruptcy court.
In New
So
York.
then we had to hire bankruptcy counsel in New York, send our attorneys back to New York to deal with that bankruptcy counsel. The first thing we had to do was get the bankruptcy transferred from New York back out here. By the way, if there are any lawyers that are really bizarre to deal with, it's bankruptcy counsel. But in any event, then we were back in bankruptcy court here. And
That was a critical move.
oh, absolutely.
Very
That was a loss for them that it came back here. And then what we wanted to do while the bankruptcy proceeded was nonetheless get the stay entered. And if we could get the stay entered, then he wasn't going to let it be retried in effect in bankruptcy court.
I think you have to have the name of the bankruptcy judge in New York for the record. It was such a perfect bankruptcy judge named Cornelius Blackshears.
That's right. That's right.
And he was a well-known bankruptcy judge. I hope you're going to talk to Fred Townsend, because he actually went to New York and argued the change of venue back to Seattle successfully before the judge. So you need to ask him about that, but it was critically important that we get it moved back to Seattle, to federal bankruptcy court in Seattle, where we then continued the litigation in that context.
Well, and I'd like to just go slightly off course for 1 second because Jerry mentioned Fred, and I think no story of this case can even be possibly touched upon without mentioning Fred Townsend, one of the deans of the Seattle Bar, Tacoma Bar, just a wonderful man and a great lawyer. And I think certainly for me, and I think I can speak for Jackson too, one of the real pleasures and joys of working on a case like this, which, to be sure, was not your classic pro bono case where you can go in and write an appellate brief and then get out. This was a very difficult case to do on a pro bono basis, but to have the opportunity to work with lawyers of Fred's and Jerry's magnitude and the other lawyers of Preston and the city was a very good experience. And Jerry talked about the working relationship of the attorneys, and that's not to say that there weren't disagreements. There were many disagreements. I remember being in a room with Jerry and Shelley one time, trying to see if there was any way out because I was getting double teamed. But on the whole, it was a great.
I'm sure you're
Well,
right about that.
I have to, when you bring up Fred's name, it makes me think of the moment that I knew that we would win in court. And that was in the opening statements. Vogel had the first opening statement, and they had these flat charts up with, with like drawings of this is the market, this is where we're talking about, this is the property we own, that kind of thing. Fred Townsend had moved into the market. He had moved into an apartment in the Fairmont Hotel and spent all of his time down here getting to know the market intimately. He knew the market as a long-time resident. His wife is a cookbook author, but he really immersed himself in the market. And his opening statement walked the court through the market, tenant by tenant, talking about who the individual people were, so that he flipped this whole thing, not as this is some shopping center we bought with tax credits, but these are real small business people's lives. This is what this treasure of the city is all about. It was absolutely brilliant, in my opinion.
Yeah. He is a great lawyer, a great tactician, and certainly proved it in this case.
Well,
Talk amongst yourselves, just, you can go on, we've got one camera on, but Jeff's gonna change